The scent of linseed oil and aged mahogany was a comfort, a familiar anchor in my world. For years, my hands had known the intricate grain of forgotten heirlooms, the delicate dance of bringing beauty back from the brink of decay. Every scratch, every water stain, every faded hue told a story, and it was my singular purpose to understand and honor those narratives. My workshop, usually a symphony of quiet industry, felt unnervingly silent today, the tools laid out with an almost ceremonial precision, awaiting their long rest. This meticulous order was a stark contrast to the chaos I was about to embrace. The legal representative, a thin woman with a perpetually pursed mouth, had called it a magnificent opportunity. I preferred a monumental undertaking. My distant relative, an eccentric, reclusive man I'd met only once as a child, had left me everything, a substantial sum, a collection of antique maps. The house. The house, she'd emphasized, was the real inheritance. A manor, she'd called it, tucked away in a corner of the county where the asphalt gave way to gravel and then to nothing but overgrown tracks. The drive out was a slow descent into deepening quiet. The paved road, initially a smooth gray ribbon, soon fractured into potholes, then dissolved entirely into a winding dirt path canopied by ancient, grasping oaks. The air grew heavy, damp with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense foliage, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. My truck, laden with the essentials for a man who valued craft over comfort, restoration tools, a sturdy workbench, enough non-perishable food to last a month, grumbled in protest with every rut. Then, through a break in the trees, it appeared. Not abruptly, but as if the landscape itself had been slowly consumed by its presence. The manor. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a relic from a time when stone was laid with blood and forgotten prayers. 3 stories of gray, weathered granite rose against the bruised sky, its gabled roofline jagged like a broken comb. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the walls, prying loose chunks of masonry and choking the ornate window frames. Many panes were shattered, gazing out like empty, cataract-riddled eyes. A wide, crumbling veranda sagged precariously, its balusters snapped like dry twigs. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak, was ajar, hanging askew on a single rusted hinge, revealing a cavernous, shadowed maw. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall, untamed grass that had swallowed the drive. A chill, unrelated to the autumn air, prickled my skin. This wasn't just neglect, it was an active defiance against time, a slow, deliberate surrender. The house seemed to breathe, a long, drawn-out sigh of resignation. Stepping out, the gravel crunched under my boots. The air here was different, thicker, carrying the unmistakable tang of damp stone, mildew, and something else, a faint, almost metallic odor, like old pennies left in stagnant water. I walked slowly towards the gaping entrance, my determination warring with a creeping sense of unease. My inheritance. My project. My undoing, perhaps. The interior was a tomb. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling constellations in the stale air. The grand foyer, intended to impress, was a testament to decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step eliciting a complaint from the house itself. Peeling wallpaper hung in ragged strips like decaying skin, revealing layers of forgotten patterns beneath, faded damask, then a simpler floral, then just raw plaster. The silence was unnerving, a thick blanket that muffled even my own breathing. I moved deeper, my hand trailing along a banister slick with grime. the sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. Room after room, each one a monument to disuse. Libraries choked with moldering books, parlors shrouded in dust sheets like ghosts, kitchens where rust had consumed everything metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a door unlike any other I'd seen in the manor. It was solid, unadorned steel, bolted shut with heavy, industrial-looking latches. My fingers fumbled with the cold metal. One latch gave way with a screech, then another. The third was stiff, requiring a shoulder to force it open. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing a small, stark room. No grand furniture, no ornate fireplace. Just concrete walls, a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and in the center of the far wall, a thick, rectangular pane. It was not a window to the outside. This was a visiting room with reinforced glass. The glass itself was at least 3 inches thick, murky with age and dirt, but undeniably engineered for strength, for containment. On my side, a narrow, built-in shelf ran beneath it, almost like a counter for placing objects. On the other side, visible through the grime, was a small, empty space, equally austere. Who would build such a room in a private residence? And for what purpose? My jaw tightened. This house, I realized, held secrets far stranger than I had anticipated. And I, Reed, had just walked right into them. I started in the smaller study, a room tucked away off the main hall, its once grand walnut paneling now obscured by a century of grime. This felt like a manageable first step, a place where I could establish my meticulous rhythm without feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the house. I unfurled my heavy canvas dropcloths, protecting the ancient, dust-laden floorboards, then carefully arranged my tools, an array of chisels, delicate scrapers, varying grades of sandpaper, pots of restorative linseed oil, and my own specially blended wax. The sharp, clean aroma of these materials, so familiar and reassuring, sliced through the pervasive damp and decay that clung to every surface. The first few hours were a bomb. I lost myself in the work, the focused concentration a welcome antidote to the manor's oppressive silence. My fingers moved with practiced ease, gently coaxing layers of ancient varnish from a section of paneling, slowly revealing the rich, dark grain of the wood beneath. The house, for its part, seemed to hold its breath. Then, the first tremor of unease. I reached for my smallest gouge, the one with the finely curved tip I used for intricate detailing. It wasn't in its tray. I distinctly remembered placing it there moments before, after sharpening its edge. I paused, a flicker of annoyance, attributing it to a momentary lapse in my own usually disciplined mind. I found it on the floor, not far, but tucked beneath a stack of old, brittle ledgers I hadn't yet touched. Odd. I picked it up, wiped a speck of dust from its handle, and returned to my task, dismissing the incident. A faint scraping sound, like dry fingernails dragging across coarse stone, seemed to emanate from the floorboards directly above me. I froze, my hand hovering over the wood, listening intently. Nothing. Only the rhythmic, monotonous drip of a distant leaky gutter. My imagination, I decided, was playing tricks, amplified by the unfamiliar quiet. The next day, the disturbances became less dismissible. This felt different, more deliberate. My heart gave a quick, unwelcome thump against my ribs, a sudden, sharp flutter. But the sensation of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking my every movement, began to cling to me like the fine, pervasive dust. My tools, too, continued their strange, unsettling dance. A small pot of wood filler I'd placed firmly on my workbench vanished, only to reappear later on the mantelpiece, its lid slightly askew. My favorite sanding block, which had been right beside my hand, turned up on the highest shelf of a built-in bookcase, far out of reach without a ladder. This was beyond mere forgetfulness. This was impossible. There was someone else in the house? I'd locked the main gates, secured every entrance. I decided to investigate the wall directly behind the built-in desk. A slight change in tone. Almost imperceptible. Instead, I found not a cavity, but a thin, almost invisible seam in the plaster behind it. It was a doorway, expertly concealed, blending perfectly with the surrounding wall. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers traced the outline, finding a small, almost flush handle that required a firm twist to engage. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something faintly metallic and acrid, like old electricity or ozone. I grabbed my powerful work lamp and stepped cautiously into the gloom. The passage opened into a small, windowless chamber. But one entire wall was dominated by something utterly out of place, a visiting room with reinforced glass. My lamp beam swept across it. The glass itself was incredibly thick, streaked with what looked like ancient grime, but undeniably reinforced, designed for strength and separation. On the other side, directly facing my position, a single, heavy, bolted-down chair stood in stark isolation. It was a stark, unsettling space, meticulously designed for observation, for containment. And who, or what, was meant to be on the other side of that formidable glass? The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer a vague unease, but a sharp, invasive certainty. I wasn't alone in this house. And whatever was here, knew I had found its secret. I was good at listening, but this house had too many stories, too many whispers trapped within its crumbling plaster and warped timbers. I'd spent the morning in the library, a vast, echoing space that smelled of mildewed paper and something metallic, like old coins left in a damp drawer. The original owner's collection of obscure local histories was still mostly intact, though many volumes were fused shut by time and damp. My task for the day was to carefully remove a section of ornate wall paneling that felt suspiciously loose, revealing a patch of damp behind it. Water ingress, I'd assumed. Another battle against the relentless march of decay. I worked methodically, the gentle scrape of my flat chisel against the aged wood a steady rhythm in the silence. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. As I eased the final panel free, it didn't reveal damp plaster as expected. My breath hitched. My hand closed around a small, leather-bound book, surprisingly heavy, and a thin, rolled parchment secured with a tarnished silver ribbon. The air that puffed out from the cavity was stagnant, thick with the smell of dried earth and something else. Something subtly acrid, like burnt sugar. Pulling them out, I laid them on the dusty floorboards. The book was a ledger, its leather cover brittle and cracked, the gilt lettering on the spine long since flaked away. The parchment, when unrolled, revealed a crudely drawn map of the manor grounds, crisscrossed with faded ink lines and indecipherable symbols. But it was the ledger that drew me in. Its pages, though yellowed and foxed, were filled with a spidery, looping script. It wasn't a financial record. It was a journal. The first entries were mundane, detailing construction dates and material orders. Then the tone shifted. The handwriting became frantic, the ink bleeding in places as if pressed with too much force. There were mentions of the peculiar nature of the land, the unsettling quiet, and unsettlingly, the draining.
What was draining? It didn't specify. Later entries referred to a visiting room with reinforced glass, described as a necessary measure, a place to contain the influence.
My gaze drifted from the journal to the map, then back to the words.
I knew that room.
I'd walked past it countless times in my initial surveys. It was tucked away in a seldom-used wing, a stark, anachronistic anomaly in the otherwise ornate architecture. I dismissed it as some eccentricity of a previous owner, perhaps a place for a reclusive relative to meet guests without risk of contagion, or simply a peculiar design choice.
But to contain the influence? That phrase echoed in my mind, raising goosebumps on my arms.
I spent the next hour poring over the journal, the words growing increasingly disjointed, repetitive, almost obsessive. There were mentions of the slippage, the fading names, and the hunger in the quiet. It read less like a coherent narrative and more like the fragmented thoughts of someone losing their grip. The final entry, scrawled diagonally across the last page, was just 2 words: it remembers.
A sudden tightness seized my chest.
I blinked, trying to clear a strange fuzziness from my vision.
What was I just doing? I had been reading the journal, hadn't I?
My hands were still holding it, but for a split second, the previous 10 minutes had blurred. I shook my head, attributing it to the dry, dusty air and the sheer concentration.
It was probably just a minor disorientation.
I'd been working nonstop for weeks, pushing myself to the limit. Isolation, coupled with the physical demands of the restoration, could do strange things to a person. I carefully placed the journal and map into my satchel, planning to examine them more closely later, perhaps after a strong cup of coffee. As I stood up, my knee cracked loudly, and I realized I'd been kneeling on the hard floor for far too long. I walked towards the kitchen, my steps echoing in the vast, silent house. As I passed the grand staircase, I paused. Had I turned off the light in the library? I distinctly remembered flipping the switch before I left. Yet, a faint glow emanated from the doorway. I frowned, retracing my steps. I must be more tired than I thought. My mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling persisted, a subtle, unsettling disconnect. It was as if a crucial piece of my internal compass had shifted, just slightly, throwing everything else off balance. I felt a fleeting uncertainty about my own hands, my own name, my own purpose in this decaying manor. Reed. My name was Reed. I repeated it in my head, a small anchor in the rising tide of unease. It was just stress, I told myself. Just the house getting to me. A sudden tightness seized my chest. What was I just doing? I had been reading the journal, hadn't I? I shook my head, attributing it to the dry. The journal lay open on my lap, its brittle pages smelling of dust and something else, something faintly metallic and cold. 10 minutes, gone. Just like that. It wasn't just a brief lapse, it was a blank space, a missing chunk of time where I knew I had been engaged in an activity, but the details refused to coalesce. My brow furrowed. This wasn't simple fatigue. This was unsettling. I closed the journal, placing it carefully on the heavy oak desk. The incident spurred a fresh wave of determination. Whatever this manor held,
Whatever was causing these strange mental tremors, I needed to understand it. I needed facts. My research began in earnest. The Manor's library, though extensive, offered little beyond dusty treatises on agriculture and forgotten poetry. The internet, however, was a labyrinth. Local historical societies had digitized some archives, and I spent hours hunched over my laptop, the screen a stark blue against the growing twilight outside. I sifted through property deeds, census records, and old newspaper clippings, my fingers stiff from typing. The initial results were frustratingly vague. The manor, referred to interchangeably as Blackwood House or the Thorn Estate, had a surprisingly sparse public record for a property of its age and grandeur. Then, I started finding them, the fragments. Not explicit accounts of horror, but whispers. An article from 1888 mentioned the sudden and inexplicable departure of the Thorn family, leaving behind a fully furnished estate. Another, from the early 1900s, spoke of a peculiar affliction of the mind that befell the manor's brief subsequent owner. A prominent merchant, leading to his permanent retirement from public life. There were mentions of unexplained disappearances of household staff in the 1930s. Always attributed to wandering off or seeking opportunities elsewhere, despite the manor's remote location making such casual departures unlikely. Each account was isolated, disconnected, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting only slivers of a larger, terrifying image. That night, the dreams began their true assault. I found myself in a sprawling, empty version of the manor, the air thick with a cloying sweetness that made my teeth ache. I saw figures in the periphery of my vision, shifting, indistinct shapes that felt familiar, yet utterly alien. They weren't threatening in a physical sense, they were consuming. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and as they passed, the walls behind them seemed to fade, the very fabric of the house dissolving into a featureless gray. I woke with a gasp, the phantom sweetness still clinging to my palate, my heart thrumming against my ribs. For a full minute, I couldn't recall my own name. The waking hours offered little respite. The manor itself seemed to conspire against my senses. I'd be polishing a banister, my rag gliding over the smooth wood, and for a fleeting instant, the grain would ripple, the surface appearing to shift like disturbed water. Sounds became distorted. The creak of a floorboard above me would morph into a low, guttural sigh, only to resolve back into unsettling. The scent of damp earth and decay, ever present, would sometimes sharpen, becoming acrid, metallic, reminding me of the journal. The memory gaps grew bolder, more aggressive. I'd be in the middle of meticulously cleaning a delicate porcelain figurine, only to find myself standing in the kitchen, a half-eaten apple in my hand, with no recollection of leaving the study, or even peeling the fruit. Hours would vanish, leaving behind only a vague sense of unease and a gnawing uncertainty. Was I sleeping on my feet? Was the isolation finally getting to me? One afternoon, the world fractured entirely. I was examining a faded tapestry in the drawing room, tracing the intricate threads of a forgotten hunting scene, when a sudden, jarring shift occurred. The tapestry shimmered, then dissolved. I was no longer in the drawing room. I stood in a stark, utilitarian space. The floor was polished concrete, the walls a dull, institutional gray. Before me, dominating the room, was a large, reinforced glass partition, stretching from floor to ceiling. How had I gotten here? Where was here? Panic flared, hot and sharp. I pressed my palm against the cool, unyielding glass,
my reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't quite right. Through the glass, on the other side, was nothing. An empty chair, bolted to the floor, facing me. But then, a faint shimmer. A disturbance in the air, like heat haze over asphalt. It solidified, not into a person, but into an impression. A silhouette, tall and impossibly thin, its edges blurred, like a figure drawn in charcoal and then smudged. It felt ancient, hungry. Then, a sound. They all forgot. The air in the visiting room grew heavy, suffocating. My head began to throb, a dull, persistent ache behind my eyes. It was reaching, searching. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The sterile walls wavered. The disinfectant smell faded. I blinked, hard, and found myself back in the drawing room, my hand still resting on the rough weave of the tapestry. The hunting scene was intact. The scent of old wool was back. My reflection in the nearby mirror was my own, albeit pale and wide-eyed. The memory of the visiting room, of the empty chair, of the blurred silhouette and the intrusive thought, was vivid, utterly real. And then, a new piece of information clicked into place, not from the vision, but from the forgotten archives. It asks for fragments of what makes us whole. The manor wasn't just erasing my memory, it was consuming it. And I had just seen a glimpse of its terrible appetite, and perhaps, the fate of those who came before me. The rope was fraying, all right. I could feel the individual strands snapping, one by one, with every shadow that shifted in the manor's periphery. My mind, once a meticulously organized archive of memories and facts, was becoming a chaotic mess. Names slipped from my grasp like wet soap. Faces blurred. I'd walk into a room, convinced I was looking for something vital, only for the purpose to evaporate the moment I crossed the threshold. The manor wasn't just old, it was hungry. Its pages were blank, or perhaps my eyes simply couldn't decipher what was there. I squeezed my eyelids shut, pressing the cool leather against my forehead, trying to anchor myself. Reed. My name is Reed. I restore antiques. I inherited this house. Each thought was a desperate plea against the encroaching fog. When I opened my eyes again, the grand hall was gone. The ornate wallpaper, the sweeping staircase, the oppressive gloom, all replaced by something stark and alien. The air hummed with a low, almost imperceptible thrum, like distant machinery. The light was flat, diffused, emanating from unseen sources in a ceiling that seemed impossibly high and smooth. There were no windows. No doors that I could see. This wasn't the manor. This wasn't anywhere I knew. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Before me, stretching from floor to ceiling, was a massive sheet of reinforced glass. It was thick, at least 2 inches, and utterly transparent, separating me from an identical, sterile room on the other side. A visiting room with reinforced glass. Why did I know that name? What was this place? My reflection stared back at me, distorted slightly by the glass's thickness. But it wasn't just distortion. The figure on the other side was almost me, but his eyes were too wide, too vacant. His skin had a papery translucence, and his mouth was a grim, silent O. He was wearing my clothes, but they hung on him as if he'd shrunk. The reflection didn't speak. Instead, its eyes, those 2 wide, empty eyes, seemed to bore into mine. And then, the images began. They weren't flashes, but a slow, insidious seep. A memory of my mother, her laugh bright and clear, suddenly muted, her face blurring, her features shifting into something I couldn't quite grasp. My own hands, once deft and precise, appeared clumsy, trembling, incapable. They were my memories, or what had been my memories, being rewritten, erased, replaced. The figure across the glass mirrored my movements, a grotesque mime. When I clenched my fists, so did he. When I squeezed my eyes shut, his eyelids fluttered. But his mimicry wasn't comforting, it was a horrifying confirmation that he was me, or what was left of me. The empty space. The forgotten vessel. I screamed then, a raw, guttural sound that tore from my throat. No! I'm Reed. I'm here. The images intensified. My childhood home, once a vibrant collection of colors and warmth, dissolved into crumbling plaster and rotting wood. My friends, their faces once so distinct, became generic, interchangeable figures, then vanished entirely. My skills, my passions, my very history, all were being systematically dismantled. It was like watching an old film reel burn, the frames curling and blackening until nothing remained but smoke. A searing pain flared behind my eyes, as if my brain itself was being scraped clean. I slid down the reinforced glass, my knees giving out, my body trembling uncontrollably. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through my very bones. The figure on the other side of the glass, the ghost of myself, simply watched. Its vacant eyes seemed to widen further, absorbing the last vestiges of my identity. I could feel my own name, Reed, clinging precariously to the edge of my consciousness, a single, frayed thread against the onslaught. But even that began to unravel. Was it Reed, or was it something else? Someone else? The boundary between myself and the terrifying, consuming emptiness blurred, thinned, and threatened to dissolve entirely. I was losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. And the manor, or whatever monstrous thing dwelled within it, was feasting. The echo of my own desperate cry died in the heavy air, leaving me with a phantom vibration in my throat. I'm Reed, I whispered, testing the name, letting it roll on my tongue. It tasted distant. Like a word learned from a book, not something intimately known. My childhood home, that fleeting vision, had indeed dissolved, leaving behind a gray, featureless expanse in my mind. A terrifying blankness where warmth and laughter should have been. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog. I had to get out. This wasn't just about restoring a house anymore, it was about preserving whatever fragmented pieces of myself remained. I scrambled to my feet, the worn floorboards groaning under my weight. It made my stomach churn. I lurched towards the study door, my intention clear, leave. I twisted it, pulled. It moved freely, the door swinging inward with an almost eager sigh. Not locked. Good. I stumbled out into the hallway, my eyes darting left, then right. Which way was out? The main entrance. I remembered the grand double doors, the stone steps, the gravel drive, or did I? I blinked, forcing the hallucination away. Focus, Reed. I started walking, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loudly. The house seemed to stretch, the familiar dimensions warping. A doorway I was certain led to the kitchen now opened into a dusty, unused parlor. The grand staircase, usually directly ahead, was nowhere to be seen. I tried another, and another, each leading to another identical, forgotten room, choked with shrouded furniture and the smell of stagnant air. Every path I took seemed to lead me deeper into the house, further from any exit. The walls themselves felt like they were breathing, the old plaster exhaling a fine dust that coated my tongue. My throat tightened. This wasn't just old architecture. This was impossible. I felt the familiar weight of my mobile phone in my pocket and pulled it out, my fingers fumbling. No signal. Of course. I tried the landline, hunting for the antique rotary phone in the library. No dial tone, just a faint, persistent hiss, like the sigh of distant waves. A voice, thin and reedy, calling a name that wasn't mine. No, I muttered, shaking my head vigorously. No. I needed a different approach. A window. There had to be a window that opened. I pushed through another archway, finding myself in a long, narrow corridor I didn't recognize. At the end of the corridor, a single, heavy door stood ajar, spilling a weak, yellowish light. A strange light for the manor, which usually bathed in muted, dusty grays. Curiosity, or perhaps desperation, pulled me forward. The door creaked open further as I pushed it, revealing a room I had never seen before. It was small, stark, and utterly out of place within the manor's ornate decay. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige. A single, uncomfortable-looking chair was bolted to the floor. But what truly captured my attention was the far wall, a massive panel of thick, reinforced glass. Not the manor's overgrown gardens, but a hazy, indistinct street, maybe a few distant, blurred figures. It was a visiting room with reinforced glass, like something from a secure facility, bafflingly inserted into this ancient house. It was incredibly thick, distorting the view slightly, making the outside world seem even more unreachable. I pounded on it, a dull thud against the heavy pane. Hello? Can anyone hear me? My voice sounded muffled, trapped within the sterile confines of the room. The figures outside, if they were figures, didn't react. They didn't even seem to be moving. Then, a flicker. Not outside, but in the glass itself. A ripple, like water, across its surface. My reflection, pale and gaunt, wavered. And then, for a horrifying instant, it shifted. My mouth stretched into a grotesque, too-wide smile that wasn't my own. The skin around my reflection's eyes crinkled, as if in malicious amusement. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only my own terrified face staring back. The distorted reflection, the impossible smile. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The entity was here, in the glass, in the very walls. It was showing me that even if I could see outside, I was utterly, irrevocably trapped. A new wave of disorientation washed over me, heavier this time. What was I doing here? Why was I pressing my face against this glass? Who was I trying to reach? The faces of my colleagues, my few friends, flickered at the edge of my mind, dissolving before I could grasp them. Their names, their details, slid away like water over smooth stone. The sweet, cloying smell in the air seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a shroud. I was Reed. I knew that much. The heavy door, slightly ajar, looked like a mouth ready to swallow the remaining slivers of light. I pushed it open slowly. The hinges shrieked, a sound like tortured metal, scraping against the oppressive silence of the corridor. What lay beyond was not another grand hall or a forgotten parlor, but something altogether different, something stark and functional, yet utterly chilling. I stepped into a small, windowless chamber. The air here was dead, heavy with the scent of old dust, stale damp, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of fear, like iron left too long in the rain. 2 chairs, also metal, stood opposite each other, one pushed in, the other slightly askew. But my gaze was drawn to the far wall. There it was, the visiting room with reinforced glass. A thick, opaque pane, perhaps an inch or more deep, set into the concrete, separating this small chamber from another, identical one beyond it. The glass itself was murky, filmed with grime and age, making it impossible to see clearly into the other side. It was like looking into a distorted, liquid mirror, reflecting my own pale, anxious face back at me. This wasn't a room for living, it was a room for observation, for containment, for something profoundly unsettling. Why would a manor house have a room like this? It spoke of deliberate isolation, of a desperate attempt to control something. My eyes scanned the concrete walls, searching for a clue, a switch, anything. In a far corner, partially obscured by a crumbling section of plaster, I noticed a small, recessed panel. It was a safe, or what remained of one, its rusted door hanging open like a broken jaw. I approached it warily, the soles of my shoes echoing unnaturally on the bare concrete. Inside the safe, tucked away from light and air, lay a stack of brittle, leather-bound journals and a handful of faded photographs. My fingers trembled as I reached for the top journal. The leather cracked under my touch, releasing a puff of fine, acrid dust. The script inside was elegant, if archaic, written in fading sepia ink. The first entry was dated nearly 2 centuries ago. It belonged to an ancestor, a scholar, judging by the meticulous detail. He spoke of the presence, a subtle shift in the manor's atmosphere, a feeling of being watched, of thoughts not quite his own. He wrote of the consumption, of how memories began to fray, identities to blur. Not just his own, but those of others in the household. This was it. The truth. I flipped through the pages, scanning for keywords, for understanding. The scholar had dedicated his life to understanding the entity, as he eventually named it. He believed it was primordial, a thing born of the earth itself, rooted deep beneath the manor's foundations. It didn't feed on flesh or blood, but on the very essence of personhood. Memory, identity, sense of self, these were its sustenance. The reinforced glass, I now understood, was an attempt to contain it, or perhaps, to observe its effects on a captive. Another showed the scholar himself, looking significantly older, his eyes haunted, his face etched with a terrible knowledge. He described the visiting room with reinforced glass as a sanctuary of observation, a place where he could study the process of erosion without succumbing to it entirely. He believed the glass offered some small, temporary protection. The later entries grew more frantic, the handwriting more jagged. The scholar had discovered the entity's ultimate demand. It didn't just consume, it needed a continuous source, a conduit. It would latch onto an individual, slowly siphoning their memories, their personality, until they became a blank slate. But this wasn't enough. To truly thrive, to achieve its full, horrifying potential, it required a complete, willing surrender. A sacrifice not of life, but of self. A host who, either through manipulation or desperation, would offer up their entire being, becoming a permanent anchor for the entity, a living, breathing wellspring of consciousness for it to perpetually drain. The manor hadn't just been inherited, it had been waiting.
The entity hadn't just awakened, it had chosen.
The gradual slippage of my own memories, the subtle shifts in my perception of reality, the feeling of something else lurking in the corners of my mind, it all clicked into place. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was being prepared.
I was the next anchor. The next sacrifice.
The ultimate cost wasn't just my sanity, but my very existence, meticulously dissected and consumed until Reed was nothing but a memory, a ghost in the machine of the manor, while the entity grew stronger, ever more pervasive. The air in the visiting room felt thick, suffocating. I wasn't just reading history, I was reading my own terrifying future.
But a chamber unlike any I had seen.
The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a stark, almost sterile space. It wasn't grand, like the rest of the manor, but functional, chillingly so.
This was the visiting room with reinforced glass.
My boots scraped on the bare concrete floor, sending a hollow echo through the silence. Before me stood a massive pane of glass, thick as a brick wall, stretching from floor to ceiling, bisecting the room. It felt less like a room and more like a barrier between worlds. I ran a trembling hand over the cool, smooth surface of the glass. It hummed faintly under my touch, a vibration I felt more in my bones than my fingertips.
Reinforced. Why was this here? What was it meant to hold, or keep out?
My thoughts were a churning fog, memories flickering in and out like faulty lamplight.
My name was Reed.
I was an antique restorer, or was I?
The labels felt loose, ill-fitting. The entity had been busy.
A jolt, sharp and painful, pierced the haze.
The manor. The unraveling. The thing that fed on what made me me.
It was waiting.
My eyes scanned the glass, searching.
There, etched into the lower corner, almost invisible beneath layers of grime and ancient dust, was a symbol. Not a crest, not a sigil, but a series of interlocking lines, like a fractured labyrinth.
I traced it with my finger.
It felt familiar, a half-remembered pattern from a book I'd once skimmed, a fragment of an old diagram. As I focused, the fog in my mind receded for a precious moment, replaced by a surge of desperate clarity. Reveal/discovery, this symbol, I realized with a sickening lurch, was a containment ward. An archaic form of mental trap, designed not to imprison a physical body, but to bind a consciousness, to redirect its focus, to trick it into a perpetual loop of its own making.
Offer the essence. The entity fed on memories, on identity. What if it could be overfed?
What if it could be offered a memory so potent, so overwhelming, that it became trapped within it, consumed by its own consumption? The reinforced glass wasn't just a barrier, it was a canvas, a projection screen. A desperate plan began to solidify, cobbled together from the tatters of my expertise and the fractured remnants of my sanity. I, Reed, the restorer of broken things, would restore myself by breaking the entity.
The core memory. The essence. What was the purest, most unassailable part of me that remained?
Not my name, not my profession, not even my face, all of which felt fragile now. It was the act of restoration itself, the meticulous focus, the patient hand, the joy of bringing something back from the brink. That was my anchor, my true essence. But to project that, to make it palatable, irresistible, to the entity, it would require a sacrifice. Not just a memory, but the very mechanism of memory. I would have to give it the key to my inner vault, knowing it might devour everything. I would offer it the process of remembering, the feeling of identity, condensed into a single, overwhelming surge. It would be a calculated overdose. My hands, though still trembling, found a purpose. I pulled an old, leather-bound journal from my coat pocket, a blank one I'd carried, foolishly hoping to record my progress. Now, it would serve a different purpose. I tore out a page, then another. From my toolkit, I retrieved a small, silver stylus, one I used for delicate engravings. My first task was to replicate the containment ward symbol onto the reinforced glass, larger, bolder, activated by my intent. The sound was like a high-pitched shriek, a protest against my intrusion. The entity was aware. It was watching. Event. I then began to arrange the objects I had brought with me, placing them precisely on the narrow bench. A small, tarnished silver locket, a chipped porcelain doll's head, a faded silk ribbon, all fragments from my own past, carefully chosen not for their monetary value, but for the potent, almost painful memories they held. These weren't the sacrifice itself, but the bait, the lures. I would place them before the reinforced glass, each a small offering, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to the ultimate feast I intended to lay. The plan was desperate, yes, but it was all I had left. The air in the visiting room with reinforced glass was thick, tasting of dust and a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. My breath hitched, a shallow, ragged sound in the unnerving silence. I stood before the polished barrier, my reflection a ghost in the dim light, overlaid with the faint, shifting shadows of the room beyond. This was it. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I pressed them against the cool, unyielding surface of the glass. The entity was there, I knew it. It had taken so much already, the faces of friends, the order of my days, the very texture of my past. Now, I was offering it a feast. A poison. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to concentrate. Not on the fear, not on the vast emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole, but on me. On Reed. I delved deep, past the recent chaos, past the fractured memories, to the core. The precise, delicate feel of a chisel biting into aged timber. The quiet satisfaction of restoring a piece, bringing it back from the brink of ruin. My name, spoken by my own voice, clear and distinct. Reed. I pushed it forward, a deliberate, mental offering. Not a single memory, but the aggregate. The sheer, overwhelming volume of every experience, every thought, every emotion that made me, me. I imagined it as a tidal wave, a deluge of self, crashing against the reinforced glass. The response was immediate, visceral. Not a sound, not a tremor, but an inward wrenching, as if an invisible hand reached into my chest and squeezed. My vision flickered, the edges of the room blurring. The metallic tang in the air sharpened, becoming acrid, like burned sugar. Not actual sounds, but impressions, thoughts that weren't my own, yet felt intimately familiar. Who are you? They slithered, not a question, but an assertion. You are nothing. A vessel. A fleeting thought. I gripped the glass tighter, knuckles white. The entity was fighting back, trying to dismantle me even as I offered myself. It wasn't just consuming, it was attacking. It wanted to break me before it devoured the pieces. My memories began to fragment, to distort. I saw myself, not as Reed, but as a stranger. Then, a child, laughing in a sun-drenched field I couldn't recall.
My hands, still pressed against the glass, seemed to grow larger, then smaller, alien and unfamiliar. A delusion. You are just a fleeting echo, waiting to dissolve. A wave of nausea washed over me, a profound disorientation. My sense of self was unraveling, thread by thread. Was this the cost? To lose myself entirely, even if the entity was defeated? No. I wouldn't let it. I focused on the one thing that felt undeniably mine, the burning resolve to be read. A challenge. The feel of the old floorboards beneath my boots, the smell of damp plaster, the precise curve of a broken banister I had painstakingly repaired. These were my experiences. My hands had done that work. I pushed harder, forcing the torrent of my existence towards the glass. The reinforced glass, a barrier that had seemed so solid, began to hum. A low, resonant vibration that I felt through my palms, up my arms, and into my skull. Fine, spiderweb cracks, invisible moments before, started to appear in the glass, radiating outwards from an unseen center. They weren't breaking the glass, not yet, but they were there, evidence of an immense pressure. The entity's assault became more desperate. It didn't just show me false memories, it tried to erase the true ones. My grandfather's face, once so clear, became a blur. My own reflection in the glass flickered, becoming translucent, threatening to vanish entirely. I was losing cohesion, becoming a ghost even to myself. But the hum of the glass grew louder, a deep, resonant thrum that filled the room. The cracks multiplied, a shimmering network across the surface. This wasn't just my imagination, the physical world was reacting. The entity was struggling. It was taking too much. I gritted my teeth, summoning every last scrap of myself. My name. My purpose. My existence. I hurled it all, a final, desperate surge of self, against the barrier. The entity's shriek reached a crescendo, a soundless scream that felt like my very mind was tearing apart. The vibrations shook the room, dust motes dancing in the meager light. The hum died. My vision cleared, though the spiderweb cracks still laced the reinforced glass, a testament to the impossible forces that had just battled within this small room. I stood, swaying, my body aching, my mind a raw, throbbing mess. I was Reed. The entity was silent. For the first time since I'd stepped into this manor, I felt its presence not as a hunger, but as a stillness. A burdened, overfull quiet. Had it worked? Had I truly overfed it? I stared at the cracked glass, my own reflection, battered but whole, staring back. The battle for self might be won, but the war, I knew, was far from over. Unwavering. It was a name, I thought. My own. Reed. Then, nothing. Just a vast, cold quiet. I blinked, the lids heavy, gritty. My vision swam, resolving slowly into a sterile, muted gray. The air tasted of dust and something metallic, like old coins. I was sitting, I realized, on a hard, unforgiving surface. A chair, bolted to the floor. Before me, a sheet of reinforced glass, thick and unyielding, stretched from floor to ceiling. On the other side, another chair, identical to mine, stood empty. Where was I? But the victory felt hollow, a drumbeat in an empty room. I pressed my palm to the glass. It was cool, smooth, utterly devoid of warmth. My reflection stared back, gaunt and unfamiliar.
Sunken eyes, a shadow of stubble on a jawline that felt too sharp.
This wasn't me, not entirely.
It was a poorly rendered copy, a sketch where a portrait should be. A profound, aching emptiness resonated where my memories should have been, a vast, echoing cavern that swallowed every attempt to recall. A figure appeared on the other side of the glass, startling me. A woman, mid-50s perhaps, with kind, tired eyes and a sensible gray cardigan.
A colleague, maybe? A distant relative?
Her lips moved, but the sound was muffled, indistinct through the thick barrier. She picked up a receiver from a small console on her side, gesturing for me to do the same.
It felt alien, heavy.
Reed, his voice, though tinny, held a familiar inflection.
Concerned. Pitying. Can you hear me?
I cleared my throat, the sound rough and used.
Yes, I managed, the single word feeling like a monumental effort.
My own voice sounded reedy, distant.
Time had no meaning here, no anchor. I don't know.
I searched her face, trying to find a flicker of recognition, a thread to pull.
Who?
Who are you? His smile faltered, his tired eyes clouding further.
It's Eleanor, Reed. We worked together at the old workshop. Remember? Eleanor.
The name triggered a faint, distant echo, like a bell rung underwater.
Yes, Eleanor.
She used to joke about my meticulousness, my obsession with perfect grain matching.
A ghost of a memory. The workshop.
I murmured, trying to conjure an image. I saw wood, tools, sunlight through dusty panes. But it was just that, a generic image, not my workshop, not my memories of it. It was like describing a workshop I'd read about in a book. Yes, she said gently, her voice thick with something I couldn't quite place.
Grief? You were always so passionate about your work. The old pieces. In the manor. It was quite a state. The manor. The house. The entity.
A flash of something vast and ancient, a hunger so profound it threatened to swallow the world. I remembered fighting, struggling against a tidal wave of oblivion. A desperate, final push. I think I stopped it. Eleanor's brow furrowed. She didn't know. Or she didn't believe me. Was it all in my head? The thought was more terrifying than the entity itself. Because if it was, then I was the broken thing. The thing in the house, I stammered, my voice rising. The devourer. It fed on memories. On identity. I tapped my temple, a frantic gesture. It tried to take mine. But I fought back. Disoriented. That you'd been through a severe trauma. Trauma. It wasn't trauma. It was an assault on the very fabric of my being. No, I insisted, my voice cracking with desperation. It was real. I remember. Fragments. The attic. The hidden room. The old book. The carvings. Each word was a struggle, a battle against a tide of forgetfulness. It was like trying to scoop water with cupped hands. Some remained, but most slipped through. I contained it.
I think. It can't. It can't get out.
He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of profound sadness and helpless concern.
Reed, he said again, his voice gentle, you were found in a daze. You couldn't tell them your name. You were incoherent. Incoherent. The word echoed, stinging. Was that true? Had I truly lost myself so completely?
The victory, the expulsion of the entity, felt like a dream. I closed my eyes, trying to force the fragmented images into a coherent narrative.
I had won, hadn't I?
I had saved myself. But looking at Eleanor's face, at the reinforced glass separating us, at the terrifying blankness where my life used to be, I realized the horrifying truth. The entity might be gone, but it had left its mark. A permanent, irreversible scar. It hadn't just taken memories, it had taken the very framework upon which they were built. And I was left with the ruins, a stranger in my own crumbling mind. It cut through the silence of the room, a sterile counterpoint to the chaos still echoing in my skull. I traced the faint scratches on the reinforced glass with my fingertip, feeling the cool, smooth surface. On the other side sat a man in a dark suit, his face unreadable, his hands clasped neatly on the table before him. He hadn't spoken since I started, merely observed, occasionally jotting something on a small pad. So, I won, I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue, like pebbles.
That's what happened. I expelled it. Drove it out of the manor.
I leaned back in the hard plastic chair, trying to conjure the image of the final confrontation, the last surge of my will against its insidious tendrils. It was there, somewhere, a fragmented film strip in my mind. The manor groaning, the air thick with a metallic tang and the scent of damp earth. The walls seeming to breathe, the very foundations fighting against my intent. A sudden, profound quiet that had felt like peace. Like victory. It was a watchful, expectant quiet. It took a lot, I continued, pressing my temples.
My memories, my sense of self.
It tried to make me forget who I was, what I was doing there. It wanted to consume me entirely. I looked at the man through the glass, seeking some flicker of understanding, but his gaze remained steady, impassive. But I fought it.
I remembered the purpose, the restoration. The beauty I was trying to preserve. That was my anchor.
I tried to smile, to convey a sense of triumph, but my lips felt stiff. The memory of the manor, once so vivid, was now a series of disjointed stills. They were images, yes, but they lacked the texture, the smell, the life they once held for me. They felt borrowed. I left the manor, of course, I stated, more to myself than to the silent listener. Packed a few things, mostly tools. Couldn't stand to be there another minute. The air, it was still heavy with something. A residue. But it was gone. I felt it leave. A vacuum. A vacuum. That was the perfect word for it. Not just in the manor, but inside me too. I remembered my name, Reed. I remembered my profession. But the details, the nuances, the feel of being me, they were elusive. Like trying to cup water in my hands. I came here, I gestured vaguely around the sterile room, because, well, I needed to talk. To process. To make sense of it all.
They said I needed observation. The word tasted like ash. Just for a while, they said. To ensure I was stable. Stable. I felt stable. Calmer than I had been in months. It was unsettling, yes, but not terrifying. It was almost comfortable. A gaunt face stared back, eyes a little too wide, hair a little too long. But it was me. Or, it looked like me. Then, a flicker. A memory that hadn't quite surfaced before. Not a fragmented image, but a sensation. The final moments in the manor. The profound quiet. Not from the entity, but from within me. A voice, calm and knowing, saying, "It is done. You are complete." Complete? What did that mean? I looked at the man through the glass again. He finally moved, pushing his pad slightly forward, then tapping a finger on a specific line. I squinted, trying to read the neat script. Subject exhibits profound anhedonia and memory reconstruction. Demonstrates consistent belief in an external entity as the cause of identity erosion. Displays an unsettling calm regarding the loss of personal history. Continues to refer to himself as Reed, though original identity markers are largely absent. My breath hitched. Original identity markers. My eyes darted back to my reflection in the glass. I saw the gaunt face again. A subtle shift in the curve of the lip, a certain glint in the eye that wasn't quite mine. It was too knowing, too ancient. It was the look of something that had finally achieved its goal. The victory hadn't been mine. It had been its star. The entity hadn't been expelled. It had simply finished, assimilated, replaced. The calm, the stability, the almost comfortable emptiness, that was its presence, not my peace. It had carved me out, meticulously, painfully, and then worn my skin, my name, my memories, like a perfectly tailored suit. My fragmented past was its new, twisted biography. I remembered the purpose, the restoration, the beauty I was trying to preserve. Yes, I had. But not the manners. My own. And in my desperate attempt to fight, I had merely guided it, unwittingly, to the ultimate triumph. It had fed on my identity, yes, but it hadn't just taken pieces. The man on the other side of the reinforced glass watched me, his expression still unreadable. But I knew, now, what he saw. He saw a man recounting a delusion, calmly, rationally, utterly convinced of a victory that was the entity's greatest deception. A slow, unsettling smile spread across my face, mirroring the one in the glass. It wasn't my smile. It was too wide, too patient. It held the satisfaction of a very long game finally won. The humming of the lights seemed to pulse with a new, quiet triumph. And I, Reed, understood. I was complete. And I was home.